Morning. For those of you who have been to ICD events, you have never seen me reading. I always talk freely about either what comes to my mind or based on slides that I bring as some sort of a remote control version of what I think is my contribution to the conference. Today is different. Today I decided to read something because I also read myself, and I brought a book. And the book is a combination of a history book of practically the whole history of Europe as a continent, but it's also a very philosophical attempt of someone who is not by his self-definition a historian, but whenever I read things in my field, which is European integration, then I always have mixed feelings if people miss the point because they don't know as much as we do, like the insiders who have read the normal publications. In this case, it was the exact opposite of this feeling. It's not exactly right what I usually feel if someone from another discipline works about something that is at the heart of what, for example, Willem and I do on the European Union. But this time it truly widened my horizon, and I'm utterly grateful that I found this and that he did something as ambitious as telling the story of the whole continent. On the other hand, it brings me back to what I was before I became a political scientist. I studied history of literature, and there was a whole seminar on Robert Musil's Mann ohne Eigenschaften. And Man ohne Eigenschaften doesn't perfectly translate into man without qualities, because qualities has a bias. This is about quality, and Eigenschaften is much more neutral. But what Sloterdijk does is that he writes the continent ohne Eigenschaften, without qualities or whatever the equivalent is, and he puts, was sind Lesezeichen in English? Bookmarks. You put bookmarks into the long library of what European history is, and this is his attempt to cover everything in reflecting on other ambitious projects that he's reflecting on. So strongly recommended if this is your field. And here's the thought that I use for my welcome note. So, dear colleagues and friends of the ICD, and that's what happens if you read from computers. It's a pleasure and honor to welcome you on day 2 of our conference on governance, memory, and history, historical knowledge for peace building, conflict prevention, and resolution. We meet at a moment when history is once again being weaponized in conflicts across Europe and beyond, when competing narratives of victimhood, heroism, and humiliation fuel mistrust instead of dialogue. In that sense, Peter Sloterdijk's image of Europe as a continent ohne Eigenschaften, a continent with so many qualities that they no longer add up to a simple identity, is a helpful provocation. It reminds us that there is no single story, no stable essence that can be reduced to one national myth, one religion, or one civilizational slogan. Sloterdijk suggests that Europe is not a ready-made identity, but a book full of bookmarks, fragments, layers, voices that must be reread and re-explained from one generation to the next. In that sense, historians are not simply archivists of the past. You are the readers and rewriters of this book. You decide which pages are reopened, which footnotes are brought into the main text, which silences are finally named. That is why your presence here matters so much for peace building and conflict prevention. The program of this conference focuses on how governance, memory, and history interact, how states and institutions frame the past, how those frames influence political decisions, and how memory can be mobilized either to escalate conflict or to build the habits of restraint, empathy, and compromise. Sloterdijk's Continent Without Qualities challenges us to resist any attempt to legislate a single binding narrative. Instead, it invites a culture in which multiple, even uncomfortable memories can coexist without automatically becoming casus belli. For conflict-affected societies from the various parts of Europe to the Middle East and North Africa, this has very practical implications. As several of you have argued in your work, historical knowledge can either be an instrument of mobilization for war or a resource for mutual understanding and de-escalation. It depends on whether we use history to close identities, to fix borders in the mind, or whether we use it to show entanglements, shared experiences, and the contingency of what today looks natural or inevitable. In Sloterdijk's terms, Europeans have become the end consumers of comfort, who often have no idea of the conditions under which that comfort was created. Part of our task here is to reconnect comfort to its historical price, to remind publics and policymakers alike that peace in Europe is not a gift, but the outcome of deliberate institutional choices after catastrophic violence, and that similar choices are very much needed today in other regions, as well as, for example, the reform of the United Nations. Over the coming days, you will explore concrete cases, how archives and access to sources can support transparency instead of conspiracy, how education policies can open classrooms to multiple perspectives instead of a single patriotic script, how memory laws, monuments, and commemorations can either freeze conflict lines or create space for shared mourning and recognition. My hope is that this conference will do the three things: deepen our common understanding of how historical narratives operate in today's conflicts, strengthen the transnational community of historians, policymakers, and civil society actors, like having dinner together, who are committed to using history responsibly, and add a few new bookmarks to Sloterdijk's Book of Europe and Beyond Europe that point not only to past traumas, but also to monuments of successful restraint, reconciliation, and institutional creativity. Let me close by turning Sloterdijk's provocation into a promise. If Europe is indeed a continent without qualities, in the sense that it cannot be reduced to one identity, then it can also be a space where different memories and histories are held together without violence. That is not a weakness. It is a political project. And it is a project that depends in no small part on the kind of work you do. Thank you for being here, and I wish us all a fruitful, honest, and inspiring time at the ICD. Thank you very much.